So in my last video, I think I made it pretty clear that races in the Lord of the Rings Online doesn't really matter that much when creating a character, and for the most part I agree with this sentiment. That being said, this is an MMO, and if the races were all the same except for an aesthetic difference, I wouldn't be making this video, now would I? So, in this video, I'm going to go through the 8 races of the Lord of the Rings Online and go through their initial upsides and downsides, the racial deeds that they receive, and the rewards for said deeds. A quick note before we begin is that some of these racial deeds won't be available into several hours into playing, and again, what I'll be outlining is marginal buffs and nerfs across the board. If you want to play a dwarf hunter, then by all means, please do. And be sure to like the video and subscribe to stay up to date with my new player's guide to Lotro. And with all that out of the way, let's begin. So I just wanted to, real quick, thank you guys for over 100 subscribers. This is awesome. I never would have thought this would have happened. The Beorning is kind of boring, because it can only play one class. The Beorning. So technically when you play a bear, you're actually playing a Beorning. Seriously, I can't make this up. Anyways, your racial skills are the following. Might of the Wild, which gives increased might. Thick Hide, which gives increased vitality. Natural Resistance, which gives a 1% boost to poison resistance. And Few Number, which decreases fate. As for traits and deeds, the 3 deeds that Beornings have are goblins, spiders, and orcs. Completing Enmity of the Goblins grants Bake a Honey Cake, which lets you bake a honey cake that you can eat for a small buff. Return to Grimbeorn's Lodge, which is a decent port back to Bree, I guess. And Beorning Club and Axe damage, which grants a 5% boost to all axe and club damage. Completing Enmity of the Spiders grants Emissary, which grants a boost to Fate. Might and Conviction bonus, which grants a boost to Fellowship Maneuver damage and healing. And Bracing Roar, a skill that heals you and completely fills your wrath. Completing Enmity of the Orcs grants you Feral Presence, a skill that grants the Fellowship with increased fate, and Natural Diet, which grants a 1% boost to disease resistance. Finally, completing the quest Hatred of Bear and Man grants Virtuous Beorning, a trait that gives increased fortitude, empathy, and honor. Dwarves hail from several mountainous areas across Middle-earth and are miners of stone and metal. Dwarves can play any class except for burglars and mariners. As for passive skills, dwarves have 2 that decrease fate and agility, but 2 that increase might, vitality, and morale regeneration. In addition, all dwarves can wield axes regardless of class. This doesn't change a whole lot except for like minstrels and runekeepers who can wield axes, which is cool, I guess. As for deeds, dwarves need to kill dour hands, goblins, and trolls. Completing Enmity of the Dour Hands gives you Headbutt, a skill that causes a daze, Guile and Might bonus for Fellowship Maneuvers, and Dwarf Axe bonus, which increases the damage of all skills using an axe. Completing Enmity of the Goblins grants Fateful Dwarf, a trait that gives fate. Return to Thorin's Gate, which, does what it says in the name, I guess. And Endurance of Stone, which reduces all damage taken by 50% for 10 seconds. Completing Enmity of the Trolls grants Dwarf Endurance, which raises your Fellowship's vitality for 10 minutes. And Shield Brawler, which increases your block rating. Finally, Virtuous Dwarf grants 1 extra fidelity, honesty, and loyalty trait, and that can be obtained by being friends with Thorin's Hall. Dwarves are definitely designed to be more defensively oriented, so I think any class that is meant to be played as a tank, like Guardians, Brawlers, Captains, or even Champions, will make a good fit. Elves were the OG race that welcomed all the younger races into Middle-earth, but now they're secluded from centuries of war and hardship. They can play any class except for Captain and Mariner, and are generally geared towards agility with their racial skills. Agility of the Woods grants bonus agility, and Suffer No Illness grants a boost to poison resistance. Whereas Fading of the Firstborn and Sorrow of the Firstborn grant decreased fate and morale respectively. As for traits, Elves have to defeat goblins, orcs, and drakes, as well as be friends with the Elves of Rivendell to get all 9 of them. Completing Enmity of the Goblins grants Sylvan Shadows, a skill that lets you hide. Tactic and Conviction Notice, which gives a boost to green and blue for fellowship maneuvers. And Elf Bow Damage, which grants a 5% boost to bow damage. Completing Enmity of the Orcs grants you Friend of Man, which grants Fate. Return to Rivendell, which is super nice if you need to upgrade your LIs. And Elder's Grace, which grants a 75% parry chance buff for 10 seconds. Completing Enmity of the Drakes grants one-handed sword bonus, which, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. And Power of the Eldar, which grants a 2% power buff to your fellowship for 10 minutes. I think elves are definitely meant to be played by classes that benefit from either bows or one-handed swords, such as hunters, wardens, champions, and even burglars. High elves are the older, and in my opinion, cooler cousins to regular elves, as the few who have been left behind wish to see Middle-earth return to a peaceful age. They can play any class and are generally geared towards light type damage, which is actually quite common. They share the fading of the firstborn and suffer no illness traits with their not quite as cool cousins, but also have Peace of the Eldar, which grants extra health and recovery, as well as Sorrow of the Undying, which decreases your will. As for racial deeds, 3 are kind of just given to you at 19, 25, and 29, those being Wrath of the Firstborn, a fellowship buff to overall damage, Grace of Valinor, an out-of-combat revival skill, and Those Who Remain, which is a buff to will. Outside of that, you have to defeat orcs, dourhands, and be friends with the Galadriel in order to get the last 6 traits. Defeating Enmity of the Orcs grants you Grace of the Firstborn, a 10% boost to out-of-combat run speed, travel to Karis Galadhorn, and Blade Dancer, a boost to all one-handed and two-handed sword damage. Completing Enmity of the Dourhands grants Enmity of Darkness, a 5% boost to all light damage, and Glory of the First Age, a 3-second stun. And finally, Virtuous High Elf grants a +1 to Wisdom, Confidence, and Justice. In my opinion, High Elf is unique in that the light type damage boost is such a boon for multiple classes that I think captains, minstrels, wardens, and even some others can greatly benefit from this. Hobbits are a simple folk, eating 6 meals a day and generally not doing a whole lot except for you, if you choose to play one. Hobbits can play any class except for Captain, Mariner, and Runekeeper. They come packed with a 1% shadow mitigation and fear resistance, as well as a boost of vitality and morale regeneration. But in exchange, they have decreased might. As for traits, hobbits have to defeat wolves, spiders, and goblins, as well as befriend with the Matham Society to get all 9 traits. Completing Enmity of the Wolves grants Throw Stone, a skill where you literally throw a rock at your enemy. Guile and Conviction bonus, which grants a boost to yellow and green when doing fellowship maneuvers. And Hobbit Club Damage, which grants a 5% buff to all club damage. Completing Enmity of the Spiders grants Hobbit Stature, which is a buff to your might. Return to Mitchell Delving, which is actually pretty good. And Hobbit Resilience, which grants 2 hope to your fellowship for 10 minutes. Completing Enmity of the Goblins grants Hobbit Stealth, which lets you sneak around all cool. And my personal favorite skill, Hobbit Silence, where, and I shit you not, play dead and watches your enemies kind of just give up on you and despawn. It's awesome. I love it. And finally, being friends with the Matham Society grants you Virtuous Hobbit, which grants a +1 to empathy, honesty, and idealism. In my opinion, I think any class can pair well with hobbits just because they kind of just give you a lot more health and not a whole lot else. Not as long-lived as elves, sturdy as dwarves, or resilient as hobbits. Damn, men suck. Why would you ever play as a man? Men can play any class and have some pretty awesome passive skills. Sure, diminishing of mankind kind of sucks, decreasing your will and all. But, more incoming healing, fate, and might seems like a pretty good upside for that. And while that may be nice, I think the kinds of enemies men have to kill boggle my mind. Right, so you got the dead, wargs, and hillmen. Like, what the hell is a hillman? You know, this isn't a hillman. This isn't a hillman. But this is a hillman. But not all the guys that spawn in this area are hillmen. So you may as well just wait until you get to area. Completing Enmity of the Dead grants Uppercut, a move that has a chance to stun. Tactics and Might bonus, which grants a bonus to Fellowship Maneuver healing and damage. And Man Sword bonus, which grants a 5% to all sword damage. Completing Enmity of the Wargs grants Man of the Fourth Age, which grants a buff to Will. Return to Bree, which is honestly one of the best port skills, and Duty Bound, which grants a 5% maximum morale buff to your fellowship for 10 minutes. Completing Enmity of the Hillmen grants Balance of Man, which is a boost to your evade, parry, and block rating, and Strength of Morale, which is actually a pretty darn good healing skill. And finally, by being friends with the Men of Bree, you can purchase Virtuous Man, which grants a +1 to confidence, justice, and patience. I think men really benefit from the strong men buff. So, I mean, any class that uses might, such as your brawlers, guardians, captains, and champions, will really benefit from being a man. The newest race as of this video, the River Hobbit, is the last of their kind remaining east of the Misty Mountains. They can play any class. Yes, that includes Captain. As for passive traits, they have this one. I'm not even going to begin to try and pronounce that name. Seclusion breeds suspicion, which is a decrease of will. Slippery like a fish, which is an increase to agility. Swimmer, which grants a 1% frost mitigation boost. And daggers. Anybody can use a dagger if you're a river hobbit. As for traits and deeds, river hobbits have to defeat wolves, wood trolls, orcs, and goblins, as well as complete 2 quests, Friend of the Forsaken at level 25, and Back and There Again at level 125. You'll see why in a second. Completing Enmity of the Wolves grants Riverfolk, which is a +25 to fishing skills. Yeah. And Hobbit Silence, which, as we've established, is one of my favorite skills in the history of forever. Completing Enmity of the Wood Trolls grants Guile and Tactics bonus, which is a 5% boost to all yellow and blue Fellowship Maneuver skills, as well as River Hobbit Spear and Dagger damage bonus. Try saying that 5 times fast. Completing Enmity of the Orcs and Goblins grants Seen the World, which is a boost to will, Way with Water, which grants a 5% boost to frost and lightning type damage, and Elusive Catch, which basically ups your evade rating and your stealth level. Completing the quest Friend of the Forsaken grants Virtuous River Hobbit, which grants a +1 to innocence, mercy, and wit. And then completing Back and There Again at level 125 grants Return to Lindleby. I think River Hobbits can be a good fit for multiple classes, such as Burglars because of their Dagger bonus and Elusive Catch skill, Rune Keepers because of their Frost and Lightning damage, and any agility class like Warden because of Slippery like a Fish and the added Spear damage. And last but certainly not least, we have Stout Axes. They were once a part of the 7 houses of the dwarves, but they were brought to ruin by their desire for the ring granted to them by Sauron. Stout Axes can play any class except for Lore Master. They have some pretty good passive skills that appeal to pretty much any class. Unyielding Will grants a boost to will and a 1% common mitigation buff. Wrought by the Black Land grants a 1% shadow mitigation buff, 1% disease resistance buff, and a buff to both might and agility. However, Shadow of the Eye gives them less vitality, and Doom of Drasa's Folk grants them less fate. But on the bright side, any class can use axes. Axes are pretty cool. Again, it doesn't change a whole lot. I mean, mariners can use the axe now, I guess. Good for them. As for traits and deeds, again, like the High Elf, 3 of them are kind of just given to you. At 13, you get Unwritten Destiny, which is a boost to vitality. At 19, you get Fortitude of the Stout Axes, which grants the Fellowship a 1% shadow mitigation for 2.5 minutes. And at 29, you get Flame Tempered, which grants a 1% fire mitigation buff. In addition to that, you will need to defeat cultists, orcs, and be friends with Thorin's Hall to get the rest of the traits. Completing Enmity of the Cultists grants Needful Ingenuity, a 5% boost to all crafting experience, Nimble-Handed, a 5% boost to all axe damage, as well as a 1% to dagger damage, and Return to Thorin's Hall, which, I mean, that's pretty good, I'm not gonna lie. And completing Enmity of the Orcs grants Heart of Fire, which is a 3% fire type damage boost, and Stout Shield, which grants a 75% block chance for 10 seconds, regardless if you have a shield or not. Finally, being friends with Thorin's Hall grants you Virtuous Stout Axe, which grants a +1 to Wit, Determination, and Fortitude. Again, I think that any class could be a good fit for Stout Axes because of the inherent buffs and well-rounded traits that the class provides. I personally, I think going tanky is a good choice, but again, you could go any way with this class.
Oh my God!
So that's it then. Obviously, the classes that I said go with each race are just my opinion. Let me know your favorite class and race combo in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more Beginner's Guide to Lotro in the future. And with that, I will see you guys later.